Welcome back, everybody, into our generational archetype series. So, we're going to talk about the millennials now. And, millennials are a very interesting generation, right? I think all of the generations we have right now are interesting simply because all of the archetypes are very different, right? Like looking at the boomers, they are quite a special generation archetypally. Again, it's context, right? It's not just the generational planets that they have. We have to remember the time periods that these generations were growing up in, what was going on at those times, right? The boomers were growing up during, like I said, the height of MK Ultra. The height of propaganda. That's when news media and things like that were becoming very common, right? So the civil rights movements. So that shapes how the generation expresses those archetypes and how that oversoul group functions within the world, right? Of course, we know also, the boomers, objectively speaking, had the kind of the best false economy in the world. Okay, they inherited the greatest economy that has ever occurred, and so there's this false illusion that then got implanted that this is how it always is. And what worked for them is going to work for everybody else, and they can't figure out why it's not translating, right? Gen X grew up as the middle child. That's how I see them. Again, the latchkey kids, right? Growing up between, they're growing up between the late 60s, 70s, right? And it goes from 1965 to 1980. So most of them were growing up, right, as children throughout the 70s and 80s. And this was also a wild time, right? Just looking at what was going on during them, we had huge epidemics of crime, drugs. It was a lot of hyper independence for that generation, and that's why they call them the latchkey kids. Okay, this shapes their worldview. It is context, right? Now you get to millennials, and this is where I think, again, millennials and boomers have a specific contract with each other. And I do think Gen X and Gen Z also have a specific contract with one another. Again, there are outliers there, like some Gen Xers, their parents are boomers. A lot of millennials, their parents are boomers. So there's overlap here. But the reason why millennials, and again, non-biasedly, because I am a millennial, is one of the most interesting generations that we will have is because of Pluto's presence. Now, I did a whole video on Pluto, right? And I I gave some excerpts from the book, The Twilight of Pluto, which is by John Michael Greer, and amazing book, because what he talks about is that when a planet is first, quote unquote, discovered, okay, it starts to have a huge impact on the collective consciousness. When a planet is demoted, and he gave examples throughout history of when this has been done, the consciousness starts to wane, or the archetype of that planet starts to wane out of the consciousness. It doesn't mean, obviously there is tons of asteroids and fixed stars, and I'm sure tons of planets we're unaware of, right? They are still having an effect on us. We don't exist in a vacuum, okay? We are always going to be affected by the stars and the cosmos in ways that we cannot fully understand. But astrology is the study of how we are affected, of how we are connected to the cosmos, right? But there is a very clear indication that it's not as strong of an influence when a planet's demoted, or for instance, if we're unaware of it, than when we are aware of it and actively practicing with it. And so the last planet before Pluto to be discovered was Neptune, and that was back in the 1840s. And so that's before our time, right? So Pluto is the most modern example of how this works. So Pluto was demoted So it was discovered in 1930. And again, John Michael Greer talks about how there is a 30-year phasing cycle. So 30 years prior to a planet being discovered, he tracks how you can already see that planet's archetype coming into the consciousness, which means, right, it begs the question of, are we fated to discover this planet? If its energy is already coming in, is the planet itself causing us to discover it? Or is it that the timeline of us inevitably discovering it brings it into fruition, right? It's the questions of fate and destiny. But regardless, so if it was discovered in 1930, right, then that means that the silent gen, who came before the boomer generation, was the first generation to ever be affected by Pluto itself, right? In a conscious way. And they had Pluto in Cancer. I might do a separate video on it, even though we don't really have a lot of silent gens, but I do believe that this is maybe why that generation carried so much trauma, because Pluto, right, is the initiator. He is the lord of the underworld. He's not a subtle guy, okay? Like sometimes I think we can overemphasize Pluto, where he's really not that scary, but he does bring up, and there's a, when we name a planet and we claim it and we discover it, we as a collective are actually asking for that planet's energy, that planet's archetype to come into our consciousness, because it's going to help us evolutionize. And Pluto being the underworld lord and kind of forcing us to face our demons and our shadows, if you will, seems pretty on par with what was going on in the world at that time, right? Again, 30 years prior to its discovery is when its influence started coming in. So that would have been 1900. So much shit happened between 1900 and 1930, right? This is right before Pluto's discovery, right? The stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression ensued after Pluto's discovery, right? We had the Federal Reserve being falsely brought into our world in 1913. Like, these are influences of Pluto, right? Pluto can be dark, and there can be secrecy and manipulation and corruption with Pluto. So again, we see that. But the boomer generation, 1946, so this is like when Pluto's influence starts to become very strong. So again, it's about context. Like, they didn't know how to work with Pluto. And so that's why I think the boomer generation, again, not all their fault, it shows the shadows of Pluto very deeply as you keep going, right? Because part of Pluto's discovery and part of his influence was things like psychology and psychiatry becoming very popular. That is part of Pluto's influence. And so you can see as you go down the line of the rest of the generations, Gen X, then Millennials, we started to, pick up what Pluto was putting down and being like, we need therapy. Like, something's not right up here, right? And by the time you get to the millennial generation, and again, this is why they're unique, because Pluto was demoted in 2006, which means by 2036, his influence will be fully waned out. And I kind of have pegged 2030 as when his influence is not going to be much stronger. So Pluto in Aquarius right now, that is the last hurrah of Pluto. And it makes total sense that he's moving through the sign of the future and humanity and the collective, right? But millennials have Pluto in Scorpio. And this is interesting. So a few of them in the like just the first couple of years of what's technically the millennial generation has Pluto in Libra, but the rest of the millennials have Pluto in Scorpio. Now, what's also interesting is that the millennial generation, is the only generation that will ever exist to have Pluto in its ruling sign. Because Pluto is the modern co-ruler of Scorpio. So we are the only generation that will ever exist in history to not only have Pluto's influence, but to have Pluto's influence in its home sign. And that is why we are the way we are, by the way. That is what makes us an outlier and an anomaly within this story of generations. Okay. So, millennial generation, technically, and again, this is according to how they're marking it. Again, I will always say, I personally believe that Pluto's transits are the generations. Like, if it was up to me, there would be no overlap. Like in the boomers, I think Pluto and Leo, that's them. The Pluto and Virgo should actually be a different generation, but nonetheless, that's just how I feel about it, because it is so different archetypally, that it actually should be two different generations. But anyway, so millennials are technically 1981 to 1995. Some say 1996, but it's about 1995. So the very first couple of years of millennials, 1981 to 1984, has Pluto in Libra. Okay, so you're going to have similarities, more similarities to the Gen Xers. So again, these probably were more latchkey kids, things like that. Again, very similar themes of part of the transformation, part of the like death and rebirth process is through relationships, is through the discovery of the relationship with self and others. What is fair? What is just? What is balance? What is equal? What is reciprocity? You're going to carry a lot of those same elements. Now, for my core millennials, this is 1984 to 1995. We have Pluto in Scorpio. This is why it's tough, because when any planet is in its home sign, okay, now for the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, right, in Hellenistic astrology, which is the most ancient form of astrology that we have, they only worked off the 7 planets, which kind of makes sense. The number 7 is very foundational to us, like the 7 days of the week, the 7 chakras, right? 7 is kind of a core baseline, if you will. They only worked off those 7 planets. And so all of the zodiacal signs are ruled by one of those 7 planets. So in modern astrology, when we talk about, for instance, like Pisces is modernly ruled by Neptune since the 1800s. However, for thousands of years, Pisces was ruled by Jupiter. And so I'm sure a lot of other modern astrologers agree, we really should stick to the core rulerships, because the outer planets have a different connotation. They really are more about overarching cycles. They are more collective, oversoul type of energies. They don't really have a place in ruling a sign. The 7 inner planets of our solar system that we can see with the naked eye, those are really the core rulers. So like Scorpio, right, is ruled by Mars. Its co-ruler is Pluto. But we do still have to take it into consideration, because it does add another layer. Okay, so for millennials, we grew up in a time, right, where it was, so most of us grew up in the 90s. Okay, so there was a lot of things going on. First of all, we are the only generation who kind of half grew up without technology, and then later had technology still as kids or teenagers. But we're the only generation who kind of experienced both, right? Like by the time computers and cell phones, were really popular and very common, Gen X was already like young adults. But for us, right, most of us grew up where in our childhood, we didn't have technology. Like, yes, we had televisions and landlines, but it wasn't until we were like, 8, 9, 10 years old, or even like 11, 12, 13, that things like the internet came about and cell phones begun, right? Like, I didn't use a cell phone till I was in middle school. And so we have kind of this 2 world experience where we know what it's like to be totally analog, and we also know what it was like to birth into this new technology that nobody really understood. Now, also, the 90s and early 2000s was a crazy time. This was the rise of hip hop, rap, and again, Pluto in Scorpio. Scorpio rules all the taboo things. So this is where Pluto's influence comes in as well. Like, they share in these commonalities, Pluto and Scorpio, right? It's about diving deep into something. It's about uncovering what is hidden, what has been suppressed, what has been lied about. So millennials particularly are very geared towards bringing the dark into the light. We have a big problem with, we have a low tolerance for lies, for corruption, for things being swept under the rug. And so that is one of the archetypes of our generation, is like, we want to face something head on, call it like we see it, like bring things underneath the surface to the light, which can make other people uncomfortable. We are also extremists. And this is one thing about millennials that is true. And it's like the stereotype, right? I remember growing up, there would be all these articles about how millennials are ruining the economy, and that we were lazy, which is the biggest projection of all time. I think that's the funniest one, because there are true stereotypes about us, but the one that always said we were lazy, I was like, you're insane. Like, we have a Capricorn stellium and Pluto in Scorpio. There is nothing lazy about us. In fact, we're really hardcore. So millennials have this hardcore extremism to them, but that's also something that we have to deal with. Millennials were one of the first generations like to popularize like grunge music, heavy metal. Like, I'm sure it existed before, but we were really into it. Like, being emo was like a cool thing in middle school, right? Like, think Kurt Cobain, grunge music, dressing in black, heavy eyeliner. Like, that was our childhood. We were all emo at one point. And it makes sense because Pluto and Scorpio is kind of embracing the inner emo. It's like and we were also one of the first generations to bring awareness to mental health. Like, the millennials were diagnosed en masse with depression, anxiety, mental illnesses, things of that nature. And it's not like it didn't exist before. I think we just made it common of like, hey, we're all fucked up. But the bad part was we got put on heavy medication since we were children. So a lot of young kids were put on Ritalin. Adderall was a huge thing of the millennial generation. Antipsychotics, antidepressants. Also because Scorpio rules things like sex, right? We grew up in an era where everything was hypersexualized. Music, TV shows, movies, Hollywood, tabloids, right? Everything was hypersexualized. We grew up in that. We still carry that. We have we can have a very distorted relationship with like sexual energy. There's a lot of sexual abuse that happened in those generations. So we do carry kind of a lot of that stuff. And also because of Scorpio's extremism and Pluto's extremism, we were a generation, and again, I think Gen X might carry a bit of this too, but I just know from my experience, we were heavily into like substances and partying. Like, I think our generation drank the most alcohol probably of anybody. Like, it was super common for kids at like 15 to be like drinking every day. So there's this extremism that we have, this kind of hardcoreness, but it's also brought a lot of us deeper into very intense transformations. And they're very intense kind of death and rebirth processes. Therapy, medication, birth control became super popular. right? It was all about control of the reproductive system. That fucked us up really bad. I mean, now we know all the detrimental effects of that. So, yeah, we have a little bit of a tough contract. And so depending if you are a millennial, looking at where your Pluto lies. Oh, Scorpio also rules debt. Okay, it's the opposite sign of Taurus. So Taurus is about abundance and prosperity, resources, stability. Scorpio feeds into that, where Scorpio can also generate abundance, but it's more about things like debt, inheritance, leverage, right? It's more of that, assets, if you will. We are the generation with the most debt, because of the Pluto and Scorpio, and because we were sold the dream. Fun fact, and also this will lead to when I talk about how we have a Capricorn stellium. Okay, most of us, not all, but a lot of us have not only Neptune in Capricorn, but Uranus in Capricorn. And if you're like me, born between 1989 to 1991, you have Saturn in Capricorn as well. So we have a lot of Capricorn energy. Which is why we are the work hard, play hard kind of generation. Again, that's what I grew up with. That's what I saw across the board. Every millennial, every friend I ever had, we could work hard and party harder. And that was the cycle. Okay. And we got burnt out. We were sold the dream and told about college and graduate school and all this stuff. And so we all went with it. Because that Capricorn energy too, we wanted to climb the ladder. We wanted to be successful, right? We were taught that this is what we were supposed to do. The millennial generation is the most educated generation in history. In history. There are more millennials with college degrees, graduate degrees, PhDs than any generation in human history. And we are also the generation in the most debt. And so this coincides with that, right? So Pluto in Libra, Pluto in Scorpio. So again, this is our contract. It's very intense, but we are kind of the phoenixes. And we are primed for this type of ascension work. We are primed to kind of walk through the fires. That is our nature. But we do have to get a handle on our very deep emotions. We have to get a handle on our extremism, so we can take some guidance from the elder millennials and the Gen Xers about balance. Because we are not balanced people. And that is going to be one of our downfalls. And so that's my recommendation for the millennial generation, is we have to use that Pluto and Scorpio. It's intense. It's extremely transformative. We hold a lot of power, and a lot of our power is held in our ability to basically take on generational trauma and transform it. It's not a fun contract. It's not an easy contract, but it is the contract. But we also have to take on as well the transformation of extremism, addiction, depression. We have to go through a very kind of tough inner process in order to really use the power in an effective way that's not destructive, because in the shadow here, we can be extremely self-destructive. And so that's something we have to be aware of. Now let's get to the Neptunes. So again, this is for the very early millennials, 1981 to 1984, has Neptune in Sagittarius. Again, you will share this with the late Gen Xers. So if you were born between 1981 and 1984, you might actually feel more resonant as being a Gen Xer, and that's totally fair. I think you actually should be, because you have those same placements, Pluto in Libra, Neptune in Sag. So again, there's the high idealism. There's kind of this big picture worldview. You learn and gain perspective, and you gain life experience through the freedom to explore, to try things, to travel, to kind of gain wisdom through the trial and error of life. And again, you have this intense draw to transform and work through relationships. Now, again, the shadows of that can be a lot of codependency, can be, big ideals, big visions, but no action, never being able to actually bring it into fruition, maybe being stuck in certain belief systems and certain worldviews and not being able to see the other side, maybe being dogmatic, right? Being like, this is the way it is, but you really have to open up. Again, you're going to have that Uranus and Gemini opposition to other information, to other views, to maybe not be so dogmatic, to not lock into just one worldview or one belief system, but really being open to learning through your experience, right? Because that's one of the shadows of Neptune and Sag, is not learning from experience, and instead relying on these kind of narratives or belief system structures to cling to. But for my, again, core millennials, 1984 to 1995, Neptune and Capricorn. So again, a lot of us are going to have this. And this makes total sense to me. Capricorn is success. It's the institutions. It's the climbing of the corporate ladder. Okay. It's putting in the work for long periods of time, trusting that it's going to pay off in the end, because Capricorn is patient. But Capricorn can also be obsessed with that success, that ladder, reaching the peak of that mountain. So how did this play out for us? Well, in the shadow, right? Again, the shadow of any Neptune generation is Neptune can bring you the vision, the imagination, the ideal, the higher perspective, this very kind of spiritual open-mindedness to bring a new vision to the world, okay? In its shadow, you are completely deluded. You are in delusion about something, okay? You either can't bring that vision into reality, or you are denying reality, okay? And you are buying into illusions. We bought into the illusion. Again, we were sold the dream, Neptune and Capricorn, that if we worked hard and we put in the work long term, and we all went to college and we went to grad school and we did the grunt work, right? A lot of us did free internships. That was super common when I was like in my teenage years and young 20s. That was almost the norm. Okay. Like if you really wanted a job, you were going to do a free internship, or you were going to do an apprenticeship. We got paid virtually fucking nothing, okay, to gain experience, right? It was actually expected of us. I don't know how many friends I had in college, including myself, who did free internships, because it was all about the experience and we were going to put in the work and it was going to pay off later. Did it? Absolutely fucking not. We were so deluded. And again, and now you see the difference, right? You see that this total change, whereas now in this current day and age, and we'll get to Gen Z, right? They're like, absolutely not. Like, I'm not working for free. If I don't get like all these benefits and all these things. And so you kind of see the pendulum swung a little bit to, what I would say is some entitlement. But we never stood up for ourselves. We took it as like, well, this is just what you do, right? Because again, this is what the boomers told us. This is what they told us. Okay. We took low salaries, free internships, volunteer work. We did it all. And we were so deluded and under this illusion that we were going to rise up the ladder and eventually become successful. And it didn't happen. And I think that moment, especially when Pluto entered Capricorn, so that was from 2008 to 2025, that was hitting on our Neptune the entire time. Okay. And I believe that was when things started to click, where it was like, oh, this isn't what we thought it was going to be. Right. And so we had to break out of those illusions to bring a higher vision into this world of institution and structure. So again, I think a lot of us were disillusioned. I think we just didn't use our own discernment. We just kind of listened to everyone around us. And that was like part of our learning lesson. But I can also see in the higher, right, millennials were a big push to bring in work-life balance. So we are a generation that believes, right, that's our ideal. Neptune and Capricorn. We're like, yeah, we can work hard and we can be patient and persevere and to build something and be successful, but we've got to have a work-life balance. We were one of the first generations who talked about mental health in the workplace. Who talked about having mental health days. Now, again, we've seen the pendulum swing to now it's like extreme, right? And everybody believes that they should just, have days off all the time. And again, this is where Gen Z and millennials are rubbing each other the wrong way because we're like, we didn't get none of that shit, okay? But I do believe we have an ideal of a way that systems and structures and institutions and the idea of hard work and how that can be brought into the world with a sense of balance and with a sense of like, what is this actually going to produce, right? And I do believe that that vision's going to keep coming through us, but it's been a long haul in kind of our cognitive dissonance being destroyed. And we're trying to pick up the pieces and figure out how we can actually move forward, right? I also think that this is where, because Neptune can bring addiction in any generation, right? So like Gen X, Neptune and Scorpio, Neptune and Sag, like I said, that can be addiction in Scorpio. That can be addiction to paranoia, addiction to sexual energy. Neptune and Sag, there can be an addiction to constant experiences. Like, I just want freedom. I just want to go. I want to be, Sagittarius loves their freedom, but there can be an addiction to that, right? Never really committing to anything, never really having like discipline. Boomers, right? Neptune, they also had some Neptune and Scorpio. So, there's that. And Neptune and Libra, there can be this addiction to the facade, to putting on the aesthetic, an addiction to relationships and putting on the show of relationships. So this occurs in every generation. And so I think with Neptune and Capricorn, this also is what led us to the work hard, play harder mentality. Because both Capricorn and Scorpio share in something, which is their kind of raw, very can be extremist energy. Capricorn's not necessarily extremist as Scorpio can be, but if you've ever met a Capricorn or someone with heavy Capricorn placements, the way that they create balance is through the work hard, play hard mentality. They can go just as hard into vices as they do into work. And so this is what's created our mentality as a generation. And so, we make jokes all the time of like, again, I'll get to Gen Z, but they've kind of created a wellness movement, which I think is really interesting, kind of looking at their blueprint. But they've kind of created a wellness movement, right, where a huge part of Gen Z doesn't drink, they're sober. They've kind of created the boom of like the 7-step skincare routine and like red light therapy and all these things, right, have become really big during their generation. It's not that they created it, but you have to see what becomes popular and what trends during generational periods, because that is influenced by the generation themselves, right? We always joke like we were lucky if we were washing our faces with like dish soap, right? Like one of the, for my millennials, like the apricot scrub, that was all we had, right? Like it was like soap and like scrub. There was no skincare happening. I don't remember drinking a lot of water. Probably consumed more alcohol in my teenage years and 20s than one should do in a lifetime. Like we just didn't do those things. There was no balance, there was no health and wellness. Like it just wasn't, like we worked out, but it's just kind of a joke. And that is one thing again that I think millennials need to do, is learn how to take care of themselves. And it's something we have to relearn because we didn't do it. Now Uranus, we only have 2 Uranus factions here in the millennial generation. So again, early early generation here of millennials, 1981 to 1988, most of you will have Uranus in Sagittarius. So again, Uranus is individualistic. He's exciting. He likes to break the mold. He likes to shake things up. Uranus and Sag can be very erratic. So if you're in that particular generation, you might find that you, again, kind of need this stimulation of experience that can become recklessness. Okay. That is very common, needing this kind of adrenaline or reckless behavior to kind of feel alive. But at the same time, what I do love about Uranus and Sag is breaking the mold on belief systems, of just totally shattering the norm in terms of your worldview and what you believe in and things like that. There's also, I think, that part of the generation, for those that like went to college or maybe graduate school, you might have wanted to go for something that was really outside of the norm, like, right, like get a higher learning or a degree in something that was different than what everybody else was doing. Like maybe it was just super random what you got a degree in, right? Or, but there was like this sense of needing to rebel against anything that restricts your freedom, and wanting to just get out in the world and learn and gain knowledge and wisdom, and often maybe in, odd ways or ways that weren't the norm, right? Now you guys are having a Uranus opposition, so with that, I will say this will, again, very similar to the Uranus-Neptune opposition that's happening for most of Gen X. Uranus in Gemini opposing the Neptune in Sagittarius is basically the deconditioning and questioning of, have I been under some delusion of what I believe? Have I been under some confusion over my life experiences and what I've learned, and how do I even apply this to the world? There's going to be these new insights and revelations there. A Uranus opposition can be a little bit volatile. So you might be feeling like you suddenly feel extremely restless. Like, I would say this is the epitome of boredom. A Uranus opposition, especially on the Gemini Sagittarius axis, you might find that you are feeling incredibly bored. And if this isn't channeled the right way, okay, this leads to chaos, because this means that anything that is stable in your life, you could kind of want to shake it up, rebel against it, because it's stable. And this Uranus is like a live wire. It's creating this restlessness of like wanting freedom, wanting to learn new things, wanting to experiment with new things. But I do think this needs to be channeled in the right way, so that you're not like creating chaos and rebelling against things that are actually good for you and are actually stabilizing in your life because you feel bored. Okay, so this is the time though to get creative and expanding into new things. Okay, so whether that be new areas of learning, new areas of study, new experiences, and taking those experiences and this new information to really spark some sort of creativity, right? So it has to be channeled in the right way. Now, for my later millennials, 1988 to 1995, we have Uranus in Capricorn. So again, part of what we're here to do is actually to break the mold of this tradition. Like Capricorn is what is traditional. This traditional path, this traditional work life, this traditional corporate world. We are here to break the mold on it and actually to rebel against it. So you can kind of see how this worked. They got us with the Neptune. They deluded us into thinking that this was our, we were just going to follow the bricks laid before us, and we were just going to become so successful, right? And then our cognitive dissonance was completely shattered, and we were basically handed the worst position one could be in. The most amount of debt, the most education, with the worst job market, the worst housing market, the worst economy in history. So what do we do with that? We have to get creative. That is what the Uranus in Capricorn for us is required, right? We need to get creative on what we want to build, on what success looks like, and whether or not that looks like how it's always been. I think we need to create new job markets. I think we need to create new forms of jobs, industries, roles, how we work, and we need to shake it up and be willing to do something different, okay? Now, as far as the transits go, Pluto and Scorpio. So again, the boomers are having a Pluto opposition. Not a fun time, right? But that's where they're at in that age. You hit a Pluto opposition, like I said, that's the evolve or die, literally and figuratively kind of thing. We are having a Pluto square, which is also not enjoyable or fun. So, you can ask your Gen X friends how they did with Pluto in Libra, because the whole time Pluto was in Capricorn, they were having a Pluto square. Okay, so for Gen Xers during the Pluto and Capricorn era, 2008 to 2025, or 2024-ish, they were under a Pluto square, right? And so they were struggling with this idea of like, how do I achieve success, right? And work hard. And maybe there was a lot of focus on work and effort and making money and rising through the ladder, and there was a lot of power being given to government and institutions and capitalism and things like that. How do we keep up with that and also keep up with our relationships, right? And do what's fair. And I think that they were put in a really hard position during that time. So for us, Pluto in Aquarius is bringing the power to the people, and Aquarius is about the future. And Aquarius is also an air sign. So it's not emotional by nature, okay? Aquarius is like, think of the internet, okay? The World Wide Web. That's Aquarian in nature. It is a network, but it's invisible. That is Aquarius. It's networks, groups, communities, structure, right? Because its ancient ruler is Saturn. Same with Capricorn. So we're talking about systems and structures here. But in Capricorn, those are physical systems and structures. In Aquarius, it's air. It's invisible, right? So like internet communities, that's Aquarian, okay? You are having some sort of interaction and some sense of belonging and community, but in many ways it is invisible. It only exists on the internet, right? Wi-Fi, okay? It's a network, but it's invisible. Okay, so this is Aquarius. If we think about AI, right? The rise of AI is happening during the Pluto in Aquarius transit. AI is whatever, we don't really know what it is, but it's some form, right, of created intelligence. It's creating its own network. It's its own infrastructure. But again, it's invisible. It's not tangible. It's not a real life person. It's not a real life thing. It exists only in some sort of invisible airwave. This is the realm of Pluto and Aquarius, okay, where the questions are like, where is power held? Is it in technology? Is it in humans? Is it in the individual? Is it in the group? Right? These are the questions that are being brought to us, and Aquarius is the future. The Aquarian signal, the age of Aquarius, the golden age. Aquarius is about the future. It's about how we evolve into the future. It's about how we change and be willing to go outside the box and innovate and create new things. It's also very individualistic. Aquarius is an individual. They are a rebel at heart. They rebel against anything that is stagnant, anything that is old, obsolete, holding us back, right? Like they don't want what is normal. They want what is interesting and new and fresh and innovative. And so Pluto being there, is destroying in many ways maybe what we thought community was, maybe what we thought that tech, I think this is the conversation. We thought technology was going to help us. Maybe now we're seeing the real underbelly, the underworld of technology and its harmfulness, right? Pluto is excavating that for us. And so we have to decide how we use it moving forward. But it's also these deep kind of transformative questions about, what type of future do we want to live in? And so this is all the Pluto and Aquarius energy, and it's squaring Pluto in Scorpio generation. And so a square creates tension. Now in opposition, which is the boomers, what they're having, an opposition is sometimes tougher because it's more of a tug of war, okay? Or it's a battle, okay? So either way you cut it, there has to be meeting in the middle, or there has to be compromise, right? In some way, shape, or form. The square is just a tension. It's not about meeting in the middle, or it's not about, one side pulling more than the other. It's just tension. But tension creates movement, and tension creates change. And so I think what it is bringing up for us during this square is, one, I think we are being really catalyzed to, again, do these deep kind of inner transformations on our psyche and our psychology in order to move forward into the future. I think it's also is going to bring up things within us where, again, we cannot be so emotional. Aquarius is air. It's objective, right? And so our generation is all about what are we feeling deeply within us? What are we sensing beneath the surface? But Pluto in Aquarius is saying you just have to look at the data. You just have to look at the facts, look at the pattern, okay? Don't be so focused on trying to connect the dots underneath the underbelly, because you don't always have all the information. You have a feeling. And so I think it's also pushing us to be like, we have to focus on what is happening in reality, not just what we feel, not just what we sense, but actually start to, use our power to implement change in a real world, real life way. I think it's also going to bring us out of this internal process that we've been in for most of our life. We have to get out there. We have to now do something with it. Right? So there's a little bit of tension there. As I said, Neptune and Sagittarius, you're having the opposition from Uranus and Gemini. For those that have Neptune and Capricorn, we have a square from Saturn and Neptune and Aries. So this one's also a bit tough. So this square, right, is basically asking us to really question where we put our vision, right? Our vision of what we want to build and what we want to create, our beliefs about hard work, right? And work effort and dedication. And we have to ask ourselves, is it good for us on an individual level? I think a lot of millennials are going to break out of the corporate world, working for other people or working for institutions or structures that they don't believe in. And it's going to spark, I think, a huge movement for millennials to work for themselves, to build their own companies or to start their own businesses or to in some way have their own autonomy in work. Because again, we have a lot of work ethic. And so we have to be careful of where we put it, right? Is the same thing like the boomers with Pluto in Virgo, right? A lot of workaholism, okay? And so you have to be cognizant of where you're putting that energy. So I do think this is causing a little bit of friction and will eventually cause millennials also to question, or want to rise to a level of leadership rather than just putting this effort into things we don't believe in, things that don't align with us, right? So that's also probably creating some work and career crises for millennials as well. Uranus and Sagittarius, again, you're having a Uranus opposition there. And again, for those with Uranus and us with Uranus in Capricorn, we are still having that Neptune and Saturn square in Aries. So we're having a Pluto square. We're filled with Uranus oppositions in Gemini. We have squares from Saturn, Neptune, and Aries. So again, we're kind of having a lot of things going on. So if you're feeling it and it feels like we're reaching an early midlife crisis, that is probably why. But again, we have to channel our power in the best way. And that is that we do have a strong energy signature, and we have to decide where we put that. And again, because you can just see the trajectory of a lot of our lives, which was you just do what you're told and you follow everyone's advice and you take the traditional route. Okay. And now we're at the age and at the point in time where we're having to question all of that and decide for ourselves, what do we want to put our energy into? Okay. And how are we going to use our energy? And we have to do it on our own terms for the first time. And it's going to feel a little unnerving because I think we work really well when we're putting our energy into something and helping others build what they want to build. Like we're really good employees, right? But now the energy is kind of asking for us to like be the boss. And it's an uncomfortable shift because we're kind of like the kids that never grew up, right? Again, me and Hope talked about this recently on our daily disclosure about how the natural progression of generations hasn't occurred, right? Where in typical history, you would have, as a generation ages, and of course the age or lifespan actually probably was, much shorter. People weren't necessarily living till 80 years old, right? And so this is also why people would have a lot of children, right? Because they would pass the work on, pass the business on, pass the labor on to their children, right? That was very common, especially in like the farming arena, the Industrial Revolution, right? The children would be learning straight from the parents skills. They would learn the business, they would learn the land, they would learn whatever the trade in the family was, right? And it would get passed on. Okay. It's not passing on anymore. Okay. The power and the wealth is being hoarded at the top. And like I said, this is why I feel for Gen X, because I think they were passed over in many ways. They've never got their turn. I'm sure there are some that have, but for the most part, a lot of them have not gotten their turn. And so it's missed the window, if you will. But again, I think Gen X is a beautiful bridge. They are great guides and teachers, and they are kind of the ones that are there to assist in every way possible. They are the glue. And that's a really important role. But now it's kind of jumped to millennials getting kind of pushed into needing to step into leadership. But unfortunately, like we are still, I don't know how many times I've listened to an interview or listened to an older generation talk about millennials as if we're still in high school. Most of us are in our late 30s to early 40s, but there's this weird psychology that's happened where we have been kept in this box as if we are still teenagers. And it's really weird. And, that kind of brings up where there's been conversations or jokes about people thinking millennials look really young for their age, like a lot of them, not all of them, or that like we're not aging in the same way as other generations. Now, again, Neptune and Uranus and Capricorn is kind of like a Benjamin Button sort of vibe. So we can maybe, Capricorns tend to get more lively and kind of younger as they age. That's just kind of Capricorn's essence. But I also wonder if it's because we've been like psychologically put in this weird box that we like are kids that never grew up. And we're still seen as kids, but we're actually like grown adults, and it's just really weird. And so, yeah, I would say this is our time to just really develop leadership skills and to start developing self-autonomy and sovereignty. And again, working on balance, not extremism, taking care of ourselves, health and wellness wise for sure. And yeah, it'll be really interesting to just see how the generations can start to work together. And I'll be back in my next video to talk about Gen Z.